Hello and welcome to another Gawain themed video. I have since seen the movie, so of course I wanted to revisit the story. For this video, I didn't do any research outside of the poem because, for better or worse, I just wanted to explore it on my own. So first I just wanted to touch on the lust shown in the movie versus the aristocratic romance of the poem. The importance of love, courtship and chivalry are central in the poem and to Gawain, who is already a notable knight when we meet him for the first time. Unlike in the movie, where he's rather irresponsible, he spends his nights in bars and in brothels with his lover Essel. And even this relationship with her seems like a pastime. In the movie, he's not the embodiment of Arthurian chivalry, but more of a wasted youth. Essel asks him at one point, "Would you want me to be your lady?" Make an honest woman out of her, as it were, but much to her disappointment, Gawain is not really committed, and I suppose this is because he knows that she doesn't exactly have a place at court, she isn't suitable, and not only is Gawain not serious about her, but he isn't serious in general. Deep down, she seems to know this too. Even though Gawain is having his wasted youth moment, he is still King Arthur's nephew, and there'll come a time when he needs to grow up and accept his duty, take his place at court, and be more than just the wayward royal nephew. Movie Gawain feels lust and even gives into it with Essel. And there is also the moment when Bertilak the Hout Desert's lady comes into Gawain's room offering him the girdle. If you're familiar with the poem, you'll know how important Gawain's virtue is to the story and in this moment, and we'll get to that in a minute, but knowing that made this scene in the movie rather shocking and daring to me because it's almost inconceivable that Gawain would actually succumb to the lady's seduction. He tells her that he knows nothing of love and he allows her to snatch the bauble from his neck gifted to him by Essel. In that moment, he doesn't consider her. He's the opposite of loyal, but we know this. He wants the girdle and he wants her, and he accepts both in the moment. After that moment, the girdle is spoiled by his indiscretion, and the lady looks down at him in disgust and says, "You're no knight." He's failed to prove his nobility of character in this regard, but this is consistent with movie Gawain, hasty in his actions, often giving into his instincts without much thought. He does know that it's not right. He says as much, but he can't seem to help himself. Let's compare this with Gawain from the poem, who adamantly refuses all the gifts from the lady initially. He feels unworthy because he can't give her anything in return, and because he hasn't completed his quest yet. He does eventually accept the girdle though when he finds out that it could help save his life. When the lady asks him if he is with anyone, he tells her there is no other one, nor will there be for this while. It's also not as though he isn't tempted. We did read about the passionate heat in his heart, but for the sake of his own soul, he swears to himself, "I shall not succumb." Ever the gentleman, after having to reject her in the poem, he also consoles her by pledging his loyalty to her. "For all your grace I owe 1,000 thank yous, ma'am. I shall through sun and snow remain your loyal man." As for the girdle, we know that in the poem, Gawain keeps it as a reminder of the weakness of his flesh. After all, he was duped by the lady and the lord. He fell for her charms, even though he didn't altogether give in. When the king calls for all the knights and the ladies to wear the girdle for Gawain's sake, it no longer has to symbolize Gawain's failure, or at the very least, he doesn't have to bear that alone. In the movie, we get a moment where Gawain liberates himself from the girdle. You see, initially he doesn't let the Green Knight take the swing at him, instead opting to run away and not fulfill his end of the bargain. And we get something of an alternate ending where he eventually is crowned king. He grows old as he's being protected by the girdle, which he never removes. But his reign is a bitterly unhappy one. Gawain gets a glimpse into this grim possible future, and back in the present, after many attempts at trying to escape the Green Knight, he removes the girdle and agrees to his end of the deal, to let the Green Knight take his swing. As you see Gawain himself finally confront his fear, there's this overwhelming sense of relief here, even though he may very well lose his head. One of the biggest changes in the movie is that there's the addition of Gawain's mother, King Arthur's sister, and not only that, she somehow seems to have also taken the role of Morgan Le Fay as well. In the poem, it's Morgan Le Fay, Arthur's half-sister and Gawain's aunt, practiced in ancient magic with Merlin himself, who helps the Lord set up the Green Knight's game. The Green Knight tells Gawain, "She guided me in this guise to your great hall, to put pride on trial and to test with this trick what distinction and trust the Round Table deserves." She imagined this mischief would muddle your minds. In the movie, it appears to be Gawain's own mother, who is a witch, who sets up the Green Knight's challenge. We see her follow this ritual, and she herself writes the note with the Green Knight's challenge on it. Or perhaps some other spirit is channeled through her. We get a few scenes prior to this challenge that point to her possible motivation for wanting to do this. Both she and King Arthur show concern for Gawain and his reputation at court. Unlike in the poem where Gawain is a notable knight and he's already earned his place beside Guinevere and Arthur, the movie Gawain needs a bit of a nudge. I don't think it's ever really revealed though whether the setup is specifically for Gawain, but I suppose it's a test either way, right? Because if Gawain didn't step up and volunteer, that might signal that he's not ready for knighthood or he's not destined for it. As for the identity of the Green Knight, in the poem, it's Lord Bertilac de Houtdesert with the help of Morgan Le Fay. Gawain in the movie is told that the Green Knight is someone he knows, but the Green Knight never really reveals his true self in the movie, or at least not that I could tell. And apart from the connection with his mother, I couldn't find any other clues. By the way, if you are interested in this character, the Green Knight, in general, it might be interesting to research the pagan themes in the poem. On to Gawain's fear and uncertainty. When I read the poem, the scene in the hall at Camelot with the Green Knights seemed fairly straightforward. The king first agrees to take on the Green Knight's challenge, even though he thinks that it's foolish. Gawain then steps up. For I find it unfitting, as my fellow knights would, when a deed of such daring is dangled before us, that you take on this trial, tempted as you are. I'm the weakest of your warriors and feeblest of wit. Loss of my life would be least lamented. Were I not your nephew, my life would mean nothing. To be born of your blood is my body's only claim. Such a foolish affair is unfitting for a king. So, being first to come forward, it should fall to me. In the poem, Gawain sees this as his duty. It's almost a debt that he owes for his privileged and protected position as the king's nephew, and, as he perceives himself, the weakest of the knights. In the movie, we see the king ask his knights for volunteers. He knows that he doesn't have the strength to take on this challenge, and after being confronted by a silent court at first, eventually Gawain volunteers. We know that the previous scenes must have been contributing factors. His mother's concern and the king and Guinevere taking an interest in him. It's not the reputation of court that rests on his shoulders, it's his own reputation that's at stake. Whereas Gawain's actions are decisive in the poem, he walks up to the Green Knight and beheads him without hesitation. Gawain in the movie volunteers, but his fear and his hesitation are very clear. He's understandably afraid and he asks the king, "But what if death awaits me?" He fears he's not meant for greatness, he says. This is obviously a stark contrast with Gawain from the poem, who is prepared for death, saying that he would rather die than abandon his duty. We should remember, though, that poem Gawain has been knighted and he's likely seen battle, whereas in the movie, Gawain had to take on this challenge severely underprepared. One of the final themes that I wanted to talk about was just the loneliness and melancholy atmosphere of this film. I miss the camaraderie of the knights in the movie, but I don't mean that in a negative way. The focus is very much on Gawain, who is a bit of an outsider. He is a little lost. He hasn't earned his place amongst the knights of the Round Table, and it doesn't look like he has very many friends. I know that this is the point, and it makes the loneliness of his journey, him being exposed to the elements, not being able to find food, even more evident somehow. It's obviously made very clear in the poem that this journey that Gawain is taking is a perilous journey, and he's lonely, hungry, and cold. But because of who movie Gawain is, the fact that he can barely fend for himself, at least not at first, it's just so sad and bleak watching him getting robbed or getting sick from eating poisonous mushrooms. In the poem, Gawain is loved by both the king, his fellow knights, and there is a warmth and a satisfaction in the way that his life is described. They express concern for him, cheer his triumphs with him, and they take on the green girdle for his sake. He obviously has to take on this grueling journey on his own, and it's incredibly lonely and difficult, but he has a fulfilled life. No matter how humble he is a knight after all. When I read the poem, Gawain volunteering for his challenge seemed curious, sure, because who would volunteer? But ultimately it was noble, it was good. In the movie, it felt a bit unjust that Gawain suddenly had to take this on. There's this moment when, in an almost panic, he realizes that he doesn't even have a sword, when he's surrounded by knights who have swords who could have easily taken on this challenge. But I suppose this is the beauty of the hero's journey though, right? Being given a near insurmountable task and defying the odds. By the way, when the giants are briefly mentioned in the poem, I assumed that they were human giants, but the ones from the movie were kind of godlike and airy, which I actually found quite fitting with the movie's aesthetic. Also in the poem, there's this extended scene featuring the fox as it's getting hunted by the Lord and his hounds, but the fox isn't Gawain's companion as he is in the movie. In the poem, Gawain never loses his horse Gringolet, and that's his only companion for the most part. As for the girl Winifred, who was missing her head, well, she was a ghost, really. She's not mentioned in the poem. In Gawain's alternate future, before he removes the girdle, she ends up being his bride. Obviously, in the movie, she was beheaded, as she tells Gawain, and he's about to be, so they're connected in that way, and she gives him a bit of her backstory, but of course, the movie doesn't really tell us much more about her. It does feel significant, though, that she is his bride in this doomed version of his future. Anyway, apart from the story, the visuals were absolutely stunning in this movie, and I'd obviously be remiss if I didn't mention Dev Patel's phenomenal performance as Gawain. One last thing, there is a post-credits scene in this movie, so definitely stick around until after the credits. Anyway, that's it for this video. Thank you for watching.